In this episode, Dr. Plotkin discusses the recent book, Psychonauts, by Mike J. In the book, the author contends that self-experimentation with hallucinogenic plants and fungi in Western society did not begin in the 1960s with Timothy Leary and the Beatles, but was a common practice amongst artists and the intelligentsia, and even some scientists in 19th century Europe. He details how such well-known figures as Sigmund Freud and William James experimented with mind-altering substances, which left lasting impacts on their careers.
Welcome back to Plants of the Gods. I'm Mark Plotkin, an ethnobotanist, president and co-founder of the Amazon Conservation Team. You can find us on the web and more information about the subjects I'll be covering today at www.amazonteam.org/psychonauts. That is Psychonauts. And I just want to share some news with you. I just come back from a so-called mushroom retreat, and there were several people who were interested in psychedelics, interested in hallucinogens, interested in psilocybin, but they really weren't sure they wanted to participate. So you've heard the term bi-curious, but I coined a better term for these people. They're psi-curious. And on that note, I want to talk about a wonderful new book by Mike J. called Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind, published at my alma mater, Yale University Press. Mike J. occupies a special niche in the ever-expanding universe of psychedelic literature. He consistently produces well-written, incisive, and accurate histories and analyses of human interactions with mind-expanding plants, fungi, and even animals. Along the way, he has also penned pieces on the history of asylums, anatomy, and books bound in human skin. In his newest book, Psychonauts, he casts his net still wider, endeavoring to explain how experimentation with psychoactive drugs by a wide and diverse array of Westerners directly contributed to the birth of psychology and helped expand the frontiers of art, medicine, music, and science. In these pages, one encounters Honoré de Balzac, Charles Baudelaire, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Wade Davis, Humphrey Davy, Thomas de Quincey, Benjamin Franklin, Sigmund Freud, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Robert Hooke, Alexander von Humboldt, Thomas Huxley, Immanuel Kant, Isaac Newton, Joseph Presley, Henry Rusby, Joe Rogan, Mike Tyson, and Andrew Weil. And this is all before you get to the second chapter. The author's central thesis is that self-experimentation with entheogens, outside of the indigenous societies that first discovered them, did not begin in the 1960s with Timothy Leary or the Beatles, but rather had a long and esteemed tradition in Western circles, particularly in the 19th century. The book provides ample and detailed support for this conclusion. Jay covers well-trodden ground when writing about Sigmund Freud and cocaine. Freud was addicted to two mind-altering plant products from the New World, cocaine and nicotine, both which have been covered in earlier episodes of Plants of the Gods. He began experimenting with cocaine in his early 30s and made the classic error of over-promoting a plant's therapeutic properties. Freud recognized its utility not only as an analgesic, that is a painkiller, and a stimulant, but also for a myriad of mental and physical problems. And he went further, as Jay explains on page 65, quote, as part of Freud's case that cocaine was a remedy for nervous weakness and depression, he relayed the claim with which Park Davis had originally launched the drug in the USA, that it was an antidote to the opium habit, removing the cravings and pains of withdrawal. Freud soon was disabused of this last notion. His colleague Ernst von Fleisch-Marxau suffered chronic pain resulting from a botched amputation of his thumb, and the resulting nerve damage and chronic pain led to morphine addiction. Freud treated von Fleisch-Marxau with cocaine, which initially reduced and then eliminated his morphine addiction. However, the end result was the worst of both worlds. The cravings for opiates returned, and von Fleisch-Marxau died in agony at the age of 45 in 1891, addicted to both cocaine and morphine. While Freud's dalliance with cocaine is detailed extensively in the book, it was his other addiction that proved fatal. A lifelong cigar smoker, he died of cancer of the jaw in 1939. More information on this and on this book is on our webpage, amazonteam.org/psychonauts. Perhaps the second best-known scientist who appears in Psychonauts is William James, widely regarded as the father of American psychology. The wealthy and erudite James, brother of the novelist Henry, was a pillar of the Boston establishment, but had a lesser-known wild side. Just a week before the end of the American Civil War in 1865, medical student James joined his college mentor Louis Agassiz on a natural history collecting expedition in Brazil. There, the aristocratic James spent almost a year in the Amazon rainforest, working shoulder to shoulder with local peasants, indigenous peoples, Afro-Brazilians, Portuguese military, which was certainly a mind-expanding experience in and of itself. James' experiences outside the mainstream did not begin and end in the tropical rainforest. Encouraged by the renowned neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell, James experimented with peyote, which he did not like. As Jay recounts, however, James was enraptured by nitrous oxide, going so far as to say that until he inhaled nitrous oxide, he really didn't understand the philosopher Hegel. At this point, I have a confession to make. I inhaled heroic quantities of nitrous oxide as a college student, and I still don't understand Hegel. The least known and most fascinating character in psychedelic history, brought to life in Jay's new book, is Pascal Beverly Randolph. Born and raised in the notorious Five Point slum of Manhattan in 1825, this self-educated Afro-American, remotely related to Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall, was a lecturer, physician, trance medium, and writer. He was one of the first Black novelists. He played a leading role in recruiting Afro-American soldiers for the Union Army during the Civil War, and upon the war's end, moved to my hometown of New Orleans to educate freedmen. Abandoned by his father and left destitute as a small child by his mother when she perished during a cholera epidemic, Randolph went to sea as a cabin boy, where, like the extraordinary ethnobotanist and British spy Edward Bancroft, as detailed in my first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, he learned enough medicine to eventually become a practicing physician. Before that, however, he returned from his oceanic travels and settled in New England, where he worked as both a barber and a dyer. Embedding himself in the spiritualist community of the Northeast, Randolph began penning works on birth control, health, magic, sex, and spiritualism. He also became a prodigious promoter and consumer of hashish, which of course is an oleoresin made from the cannabis plant that we covered in earlier episodes of Plants of the Gods. Jay introduces Randolph on page 201, quote, "The hashish vogue of mid-century Paris diffused across the globe in surprising ways. It would have been hard to predict, for example, that by the 1860s, the largest importer of hashish to the United States of America would be a Black Rosicrucian sex magician," end of quote. Randolph was not the only figure celebrating the power and mystique of hashish. Intrigued by reports of this substance brought to France by soldiers in Napoleon's army returning from Egypt, leading intellectuals formed the so-called Club des Hashishim, who met regularly at the Hotel Pimodem in the Ile Saint-Louis to consume what they called dawa mesk, a paste of hash, honey, and pistachios. Participants included people like Baudelaire, Balzac, Dumas, Rimbaud, an all-star team of French poets and writers. It was their belief that hashish could inspire creativity while also enhancing their comprehension of the human psyche. And this goes back to a topic I've raised many times in the course of Plants of the Gods, that these mind-altering substances are not just hallucinogens, they're not just entheogens, they are ideogens. In other words, they create altered states that create altered thoughts, different ways of looking at things, new ideas, hence the term ideogen. A major contention of Jay's book that entheogenic substances deeply impacted the minds and creativity of a number of great artists is exemplified in overlooked passages in two of the 19th century's greatest novels. When the adventurer Epinay visits the Count of Monte Cristo, he is fed a sweet green paste, presumably the aforementioned dawamesk, which is a hashish paste. And when Dr. Jekyll takes an intoxicating white powder, presumably cocaine, before turning into Mr. Hyde. Another theme threading through Psychonauts is the role of self-experimentation. When the 20-year-old chemist Humphrey Davy created a novel gas in the laboratory, he inhaled it and experienced, quote, a highly pleasurable thrilling in the chest and extremities, end of quote. A colleague notes that Davy, quote, leapt violently around the laboratory, shouting for joy. Davy christened this compound laughing gas. The role of serendipity in scientific discovery is not overlooked. Nitrous oxide consumption became something of a parlor game. It featured in traveling medicine shows as something to be, well, laughed at. A so-called medical lecturer named Gardner Quincy Colton would allow audience members to come on stage and inhale the nitrous, claiming that it would, quote, reveal the true character of anyone who inhaled it. At a performance in Hartford, Connecticut in 1844, a young druggist inhaled the proffered gas, fell and cut himself, but exhibited no pain. A dentist in the audience named Horace Wells decided to employ the gas on his patients, and in so doing, launched the age of anesthesia, one of the greatest medical discoveries and advances of all time. In one of the book's more memorable sentences, using phrasing that could be applied to many of the other drugs in the book, Jay writes, quote, nitrous oxide for Davy and his circle collapsed the distinction between the intellect and the passions. It stimulated both with equal intensity. To place the drug consumption in context, it is important to mention the breadth of interest and intellectual curiosity of the thought leaders of the time. Unlike the career silos that characterize modern science, in which a biologist can spend her career focusing on a single species of fruit fly or lizard, scholars could be polymaths whose interests and contributions could be much more wide-ranging. In addition to his famous experiments with electricity, Benjamin Franklin helped invent bifocals, studied ocean currents and weather patterns, and was a world-class diplomat and statesman. Englishman Christopher Wren was not only the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, but also an astronomer, a physicist, and a co-founder of the Royal Society, one of Britain's most prestigious scientific organizations. Also featured in Psychonauts is Robert Hooke. That's Hooke with an E, H-O-O-K-E. Hooke was an astronomer, a biologist, a physicist, a microscopist, and an urban planner. He's best remembered today as the fellow who, when looking at cork under the microscope, essentially discovered the cell. More to our point, he was quite the fan of what he called Indian Bengay, which is cannabis, reporting in 1689 that it made him, quote, very merry and exceedingly hungry, likely the first documented scientific account of the munchies. One of Humphrey Davy's lab assistants went on to achieve greater renown, but not in the field of science. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, despite his early efforts pursuing a career as a scientist, attained fame as a poet, philosopher, and theologian, and is widely considered one of the most influential figures in English literature. He was also addicted to opium, which he took as a treatment for a variety of physical ailments. and, in the words of Jay, to find, quote, a novel and introspective language to capture feelings and states of mind never previously described, end of quote. So prodigious was his consumption of opium that one reviewer described him as, quote, the Keith Richards of Romanticism, end of quote. Coleridge penned 2 stanzas of Kubla Khan, one of the most famous poems ever written, after coming out of an opium reverie. However, he paused to answer the door, and upon returning to his desk, had forgotten the rest of his dream, such that the conclusion was never written. This incident reflects how these entheogens and ideogens can both inspire and distract. Another friend of Davies, who had participated in some of the nitrous oxide experiments, became Coleridge's secretary, and subsequently a man of letters in his own right. Thomas de Quincey, a writer, essayist, and literary critic, he was also an opium addict. In fact, his best-known work, Confessions of an Opium Eater, is one of the most insightful and important books on addiction ever written. Jay explains why de Quincey's work lives on. Quote, his originality and the reason for his tremendous influence over the following decades was in the way he used the drug as a device for exploring the hidden recesses of his mind. De Quincey dredged up from these hidden depths not merely details that had been beyond his conscious recall, but entire worlds whose existence the rational intelligence never suspected. End of quote. In passages like these, Mike J. proves himself a peer of writers like de Quincey in conjuring up lost times and mysteries of the mind and cosmos. In conclusion, I have 2 minor quibbles with this book. Mike J.'s High Society, The Central Role of Mind-Altering Drugs in History, Science, and Culture, was the most strikingly illustrated volume on entheogens since Schultes and Hoffman's classic Plants of the Gods. Yet Psychonauts provides only black and white illustrations. For a $32 book detailing visions of living arabesques, an orgy of vision, thick, glorious fields of jewels, flower-like shapes, turning into gorgeous butterfly forms or endless folds of glistening, iridescent, fibrous wings, in the word of Havelock Ellis, quoted in the book on page 225. These dull illustrations in this book represent a missed opportunity. In addition, the subtitle of Jay's book, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind, is a bit puzzling. Nowhere does the author detail what the modern mind is and how it differs from the pre-modern one. Nevertheless, in conclusion, these criticisms are minor compared to the book's marvelous scope and scale. Psychonauts is a feast for the heart, soul, and mind, modern or otherwise. For more information, check out our webpage, www.amazonteam.org/psychonauts.
Thank you for listening to another compelling episode of Plants of the Gods. If you enjoyed this and other episodes, please post a positive review and recommend it to friends and family. And please support the Amazon Conservation Team at www.amazonteam.org, which not only makes this ad-free podcast possible, but which partners with Indigenous colleagues to help them protect both their cultures and their ancestral rainforests.